Well, thank you, Ed, for such a kind introduction. I want to start off by recognizing the Indigenous people, the original inhabitants of this territory, the Algonquin people, and also to say to Miigwech, thank you to the elders who started this off in such a beautiful way, and to recognize survivors of residential schools that may be here with us. It's been a lucky week for me. I've got to hear Albert speak twice this week. So it's one of those rare weeks. I'd like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to attend this important conference, this covenant chain, this opportunity to polish those important links in that chain that bind us all together as families, as communities, as a country. One of the things that gets talked about when we talk about that covenant chain is that need to refresh and to polish and to keep safe and to keep clean that covenant chain, because it represents those essential ties. It's not just a physical thing, it's a physical manifestation of spiritual ideas and political ideas, but it really goes to that idea of spirit, of unity and caring for each other. This Kenoshinwak Gay Magazine Dishnakas Makwadodam. So my name is Kenoshinwak, Tall Pine. I was glad to hear the elder talk about those pines. I just felt right at home when he said that. You know, when we start off our meetings, when we're in somebody else's territory, we always give recognition to the people of that territory. And it's not just out of kindness. It's a matter of protocol, and it's a matter of respect. Goes back to ancient times in a way of keeping peace with each other. And we've seen some of that in the last number of years. We hear that more and more. We hear that we're all treaty people. And still sorting through as a country how to make that reality that we're all related manifest itself in our day-to-day lives. In the recent past also, we've seen it recognized in a really significant way. Folks will remember the opening ceremony for the 2010 Olympics in Vancouver. There was 4 host First Nations, and they were recognized by the International Olympic Committee as nations. The leaders of those nations were recognized as heads of state, and they welcomed the world to their territory and welcomed the world to Canada. This deep dignity and respect that was shown to the Indigenous peoples of that area was felt by everyone in the world. But it was a significant moment in particular for the Indigenous people of the entire world. My wife and I, we sat at home at Six Nations Reserve, and it was a special moment for us. Our youngest daughter and our eldest grandson were dancers. And they danced in, they welcomed in through dance all those athletes from around the world. And so together with millions of people around the world, we were able to witness that, and we cried our eyes out. It was an emotional time, both to see our youngest daughter and our grandson there, but to see that respect that was shown to our people. And I think it would take much longer than the time we have this evening to walk through how I think in some ways as a country we've moved backwards from that significant point in time that significant recognition, and to also talk about how we got to there in the first place. I want to talk this evening about some of our historical relationships with each other, about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the work that led up to it, and the challenge and opportunity that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has given each and every one of us. It's significant that the TRC was able to present those recommendations to all of us back in the summer. This is a significant time historically for North America and for Canada in particular. We've just gone past the 250th anniversary of the Royal Proclamation, just gone past the 400th anniversary of the True Wampum that Ed spoke about, just past the anniversary, 31st anniversary of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in particular putting Section 25 and Section 35 into the Constitution of Canada. A number of significant events. A few years ago, Six Nations was honored to host a unity walk that started in South Dakota. And there was riders riding their horses from South Dakota on the second leg of a journey. They'd already gone from the west coast to South Dakota, and they were coming east. And we hosted an event there to welcome these unity riders that were trying to unite the Indigenous peoples of this land and the non-Indigenous peoples of this land, to help us see each other in a different way than what we were used to seeing each other. There was elders there from all over North America that were part of the ceremonies at Six Nations. And one of the elders, I remember him saying, we must heal our wounds from the past 500 years in order that we may not go limping into the next 500 years. I think that's significant in terms of this journey that we're all on. Through the efforts of aggressive assimilation, through colonization, and in particular through the residential school era, we've all been wounded. It wasn't only the survivors of residential schools and their families. As a nation, we've been wounded. And we've been given this opportunity together to heal these wounds so that as a country, as a collective, as many, many families and many, many communities, we don't limp into the next 500 years. We've been given guidance from spiritual sources, from political sources, from legal sources, to encourage us to look at each other in a different way. A few years ago, when I was Chief of Staff to then Assembly of First Nations Chief, National Chief Phil Fontaine, I was asked to attend a conference out in Saskatchewan with the Indigenous Bar Association. And at that point, we were right in the middle of our negotiations for the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. And I had a nice speech prepared for me on the settlement agreement. And when I got there and looked at the agenda, I seen that I was supposed to speak about self-government. And so I did what I usually do, is I phoned an elder and asked for some help. And boy, it's good to see you elders there. And Elder Gord up here too. So I phoned Fred Kelly, who's an elder from Anigming First Nation in northwestern Ontario. And I told him my dilemma. And I said, what do you think I should do, Fred? I'm supposed to talk about self-government. He says, Bob, do you know about Google? And Fred's a high-tech elder. And I said, oh, I'm the Google master. And he said, Google Williamson, Justice Williamson, Campbell versus Nishka. And he said, read that court case. And he said, that'll help you figure out what to talk about in terms of self-government. So I did. And it was a significant court case. This was just after the Nishka agreement had been finalized. And the British Columbia tried to have the Nishka agreement overturned, saying basically that there is no room in Canada for a third order of government. That through Section 91 and 92 of the Constitution, all the room had been occupied for government in Canada. And what was interesting is Williamson took us on this journey, Justice Williamson. And what he talked about was the history of Canada. And he said that the federalism that we have now was a legal response to the underlying political and cultural realities that existed at the time of Confederation. But they continue to exist today. At Confederation, political leaders told their respective communities that the Canadian Union would be able to reconcile diversity with unity. That was part of the founding of this country, this idea of reconciling diversity with unity. So it was a powerful, powerful statement in terms of what people believed the potential and the purpose of this country could be. So Justice Williamson struck down the order asking that the Nishka agreement be overturned. One of the things he said was that at the time of Confederation, the Indigenous people weren't represented at Confederation. And how could what then became the federal crown and the provincial crown, how could they even speak to self-government? How could they even speak to Indigenous rights when they didn't have Indigenous rights? It wasn't part of their bundle. And then Indigenous rights continue to exist. Later, or earlier actually, in Delgamuukw, another important Supreme Court decision, Justice Lamar wrote, he told governments and told the Indigenous people, told all of us the importance of negotiated agreements and that it required good faith and give and take on all sides. But he said the purpose of those things was to reconcile the pre-existence of Aboriginal societies with the sovereignty of the Crown. So we've had these compelling statements made by the Supreme Court that direct us towards reconciliation. In 2012, we had this wonderful gathering here in Ottawa. It was called the Crown First Nation Gathering. And Governor General Johnson was one of the opening speakers at that. And he talked about the deep roots. Again, the reference to trees from Elder Dumas. He talked about the deep roots. He said, we have deep roots together of shared promise and partnership. This was reflected in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which sought to achieve balance by allowing Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people to coexist and work together in the land we now call Canada. The Royal Proclamation predated Confederation by more than 100 years and is the foundation for our modern relationship. So we have these deep roots together. We've recognized the importance of unity. And then we went off on this path that was inconsistent with some of those ideals that, and some of those promises that we made to each other in terms of the type of country that we wanted to build. All those promises we made to each other, whether it was through treaty or through proclamations or royal decrees, really talked about respect. So how do we get from this idea of mutual respect to ideas like kill the Indian within the child? And how do we get from there to now talking about reconciliation again? We've had a lot of our history whitewashed. We've been told things about our history about each other that are untrue. And we need to sort through some of these things. it talked about the importance of education. That's clear. One of the great joys that I have is I'm a professor at Queen's University on a part-time basis. I teach a course on reconciliation. And I talk about residential schools. And I have elders like Gord Williams come in and talk to the students about his experience at residential school. So we use residential schools sort of as a foundation for why is reconciliation important. And for those of you that might know Queen's University, it attracts a certain type of student. Some of you know Queen's University. So we have kids that come from a lot of privilege oftentimes. And we lay out part of this history that some of them had never heard of. Or maybe they'd heard of residential schools but never really understood it. And as a class, I think they represent a journey that we're all on as a country. As a class, they go through this period of disbelief and denial. How could this have happened in Canada and I not know about it? Or how could I have heard about it but not really understand it? And then they get mad. How come my parents never told me about residential schools? How come my elementary school teachers, my high school teachers, my undergrad teachers never taught me about residential schools? How come my church never talked to me about residential schools? So they'd be mad at all those institutions that they grow up cherishing and wondering why some of these essential truths about our country were never told to them. And then a lot of them go from getting past that mad to saying we have to do something about this. And I think that's where we're at as a country, is we need to do something about this. Education is one of the keys in terms of doing that. John Ralston Saul, in many of his books, reminds us about these deep roots that we have with each other, the type of country that we have. In one of the books, Saul sometimes has, his books are pretty dense reading. Not dense generally, but just in his book, A Fair Country, he said, "We are a people of Aboriginal inspiration organized around a concept of peace, fairness, and good government. That is what lies at the heart of our story, at the heart of the Canadian mythology, whether Francophone or Anglophone. We are a people of Aboriginal inspiration." So a lot of the things that we hold dear as a country in terms of notions of equality and equity and fairness, some parts of our justice system, some of the essential elements of democracy weren't brought over here by Columbus or by Cartier or by anybody else. A lot of them were found here in Canada and in the United States. The government of the United States has had a bit easier time recognizing the importance of the Iroquois Constitution in terms of the founding of its own constitution. A lot of the inspiration for the U.S. Constitution flows directly from the Six Nations Confederacy. And that's been recognized by every president of the United States. The one thing they forgot was peace. But hopefully they'll get that. They have a hard time amending their constitution, so maybe when they deal with the right to bear arms, they'll put peace in there as well. But you can only hope. So there's been this rewriting of history, though. Maybe to make us all as a country feel better about things like stolen lands, stolen families, stolen aspirations. I was reading this U.S. history book while preparing for a course I was going to teach. This is a history book that was published in 1987. And in the book it said, for thousands of centuries, centuries in which humankind were evolving, forming communities and building the beginnings of national civilizations in Africa, Asia, and Europe, America stood empty of mankind and its works. Europeans in the New World is the story of the creation of a civilization where none existed. So this is a starting point for a lot of us, both indigenous and non-indigenous. I mean, we go to some of the same schools that everybody else goes to and get taught the same things. Then we go home and our mom or dad corrects us. But guess what, Mom? Just found out in school today that thank God the Europeans came here and civilized us. She said, well, Bobby. But that's a framework that we're operating within, whether it's this idea of benevolence or the white man's burden in terms of relationship with Indigenous people in Canada. That's often how we frame the issues, that even things like residential schools were an act of benevolence when we know that it's different. But it is a paradigm that we're operating within. It's a myth that we need to explode, and it's a re-education that we require as a country in order to do what Michael Jean called kind of refounding ourselves as a nation. So we know from many, many early explorers that the things that were in that 1987 history book were untrue. We know that when Verrazano came to Rhode Island, he found indigenous people there that had sea-going vessels, that had tilled fields that stretched inland to 80 to 100 miles. It wasn't this dark forest foreboding place where there happened to be some folks wandering around waiting to be discovered. At organized societies, organized governments, organized nations, many places, forms of government that were superior to most governments in the entire world in terms of things like the equality of men and women, the equal participation of everyone in the nation in terms of the ability to make decisions. In some cases, with Iroquoian people, and I live in the Iroquoian community, we had, and still do, have even a really special notion, I think, in terms of equality of men and women. I come from, one part of my family is a matrilineal family, the Iroquoian part. Women have a really important place in our society. They have the power to remove chiefs from positions of power. They're the owners of the land. Some people ask me, they say, Bob, how come you're really good at negotiation? I said, you know, I have a Mohawk wife and 3 Mohawk daughters. So even to be able to watch what I want on TV requires a great deal of skill in negotiation. So we made these promises to each other. And sometimes we hear these things like, for as long as the sun shines and the water flows, and we say, well, isn't that a quaint indigenous notion? But we know that treaty commissioners said the same thing. Alexander Morris said that. He was Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba. And he talked about the promises we have made to you are not for today only, but for tomorrow. Not only for you, but for your children, born and unborn. And the promises we make will be carried out for as long as the sun shines above and the water flows in the ocean. Those are the promises that we made to each other. The rewriting of history has withstood a lot of time, but it's slowly crumbling apart. It's being exposed for some of the myths that are written in those histories by Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars. But there's still some bias that I think that we need to work our way through as a country. We've sort of gone from this idea that this land was uninhabited to this land may have been inhabited, but the people weren't civilized, so if they weren't civilized, they had no rights, so it was still okay to take their land. to sort of getting to the notion that, yeah, okay, Indigenous people were civilized, but somehow or another still don't have the same set of rights as other people in this country. Still not as deserving as human rights as other humans. And we see that being played out every day in court. We see it being played out in issues of child welfare. We see our people having to go to the Human Rights Tribunal just to get fairness in terms of services for our children. So this bias about whether or not we're truly deserving of the same human rights as other humans, I think is something that, as a country, we need to work our way through. Residential schools didn't happen in a vacuum. There were industrial schools in place prior to residential schools. These industrial schools sought to teach young boys and girls skills such as housework, such as how to work on a farm, maybe some basic carpentry skills. But we're part of an agenda of Christianization and aggressive assimilation of children. What happened was there were people complaining to the government that these industrial schools just didn't work because children went home to their own parents, to their siblings, to their family and extended family at night. They said the wigwam was stronger than the classroom. So the idea was we had to remove these people from the wigwam so the classroom could have a more powerful effect. Duncan Campbell Scott played a key role in all of this as superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs, played a key role in terms of fashioning some of the policies that really put residential schools into effect. There's some debate about who actually said those famous words of kill the Indian within the child, whether it was Duncan Campbell Scott or somebody else. I'm not too sure who it was, but this was a philosophy that underscored residential schools, similar to what they had in the States where they would say, kill the Indian, save the man. So there was something wrong with Indianness. It was inconsistent with how we seen ourselves as a country and the ability to move forward. Duncan Campbell Scott also talked about his desire, talked about themes like the final solution, talked about wanting to get rid of the Indian problem. He said, our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. So these aren't from the 1500s or the 1600s or 1700s, they're from the 1900s. And they were fundamental in terms of an approach to deal with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Often wonder about Duncan Campbell Scott. I was on a panel with 3 survivors of residential school from McMaster University a few weeks ago. I was talking about Duncan Campbell Scott. I said, you know, I don't understand him. He was a poet. And you'd think a poet would have some relationship between their head and their heart and their spirit. And it didn't seem like Duncan Campbell Scott did. And somebody from the audience shouted out, he was a damn bad poet too. And I haven't read much of his poetry, so I got to check that out to see if that's true or not. But all this time that Duncan Campbell Scott was turning down requests from people that ran the residential schools, maybe it was for better food because kids were malnourished, or maybe it was for better living conditions because the winds were blowing right through the residential schools and kids were getting sick. And maybe it was for better teaching, maybe it was for any number of things, but almost categorically everything got turned down that dealt with money from Duncan Campbell Scott. During that time, he sent his daughter to a boarding school in, I think it was in Switzerland, and she died at that boarding school. And Duncan Campbell Scott, like any parent, was so full of grief and remorse he could barely function for quite a while. The great irony was that he couldn't see that that same thing was going on in thousands and thousands of Indigenous families and hundreds of Indigenous communities right across the land. That parents were full of grief for having their children taken away from them, sometimes as young as 3 years old. That parents were full of grief by not being able to see their kids on a regular basis. That, as Bobby Joseph said, some of our communities, there was no longer laughter in our communities because the children were gone. The effect of residential schools wasn't just on the children, and it had a profound effect on the children, but the parents who felt powerless to be able to protect their children. Some of them knew what was coming, but they were powerless. They were poor and powerless people. They couldn't protect their children. So imagine the agony that they went through when their children were herded onto trucks or onto boats or maybe a plane to take them away. Might see them once a year, sometimes more. We had kids at the Mohawk Institute in Brantford, right next door to our reserve, who were from Attawapiskat, who were from northern Quebec, who were from the prairies, and trying to imagine in the early 1900s, when you have poor people, the likelihood of being able to travel on any sort of regular basis to be able to see your children was non-existent. Sometimes children went away at 4 or 5 years old and they never seen their parents for years. Many died at residential schools. Thousands died at residential schools. We don't know the right number. We know the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came up with some numbers. Many suspect it's much higher. In the architectural designs for residential schools, graveyards were built into the architectural designs with the anticipation of children dying at residential school. So just trying to imagine the type of mindset that directed those activities is hard to imagine. And the effect on family, the effect on community has been profound. The intergenerational effect of residential schools is something that we need to heal from as a country, and it's going to take some time. I've often thought, I talked to my good friend Cedal about this, and Cedal Songda and I worked on setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with a number of other just amazing people and help from folks all over the world. But I often wonder whether or not we shouldn't have called it the Truth and the Healing and the Reconciliation Commission. We thought when we negotiated the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement that healing would be a big part of it. We had parts in the agreement that talked about the importance of the Aboriginal Healing Foundation. A couple of years after the settlement agreement was finalized, the government cut off funding for the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, which was doing incredible work right across this country to help survivors and their families recover from the trauma of residential school. So this is an important piece of work that has gone missing in terms of the life of our nation. So these policies have done great damage to all of us. They've wounded many families, many communities. It's wounded the spirit of Canada, the spirit of generosity and mutual accommodation that as Canadians we take pride in. We're hearing more and more from academic sources some of the medical experiments and other experiments that happen on helpless children at residential schools, the intent of which was to educate children, but at the same time to assimilate and integrate Aboriginal people into Canadian society. So we've had this time of experimentation, many abuses happening in residential schools, some of which are referenced in the TRC reports. Some of this were talked about in some of the healing circles and testimonials given by residential school survivors. When we were setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, oftentimes we had policy workshops about themes like confidentiality or other things with survivors. And oftentimes survivors didn't want to talk about those things. They wanted to talk about their experience. And we would have people come forward at a conference sometimes in their 70s and 80s and talk about their experience at residential schools. And it was the first time. They never told their family. Their children didn't know about those experiences. TRC should have been sponsored by Kleenex or someone, because there were so many tears shed during this process. Even though it was supposed to be a place of education, children were discouraged by school officials to go on to higher grades. At a residential school in northwestern Ontario, a federal inspector admonished the administrator of the residential school for offering grade 9. He said, if we let the Indian people go to grade 9, they'll want to go to grade 10. And then they'll want to go to university, and that's what we don't want. And in spite of those things, we have survivors that have done incredible things with their life. You know, I think of Elder Gord Williams up there with the university education. I'm not too sure. He might be the first First Nation person from Manitoba to have a university education in Peguis Reserve. Really proud that I know Gord. And many of the most awful things that children experienced at residential schools have been passed on intergenerationally. We know that some children grew up in a place of physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and as they grew older, they repeated those same abuses that they experienced as children. And so we have this intergenerational effect of residential schools that far too many families and communities still live today. Many of the pathologies in Aboriginal communities can be directly tied to residential schools. So the need for healing is great. And I just want to also make it clear that one of the things that we learned through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we learned from even setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and this is significant, is that not everybody that worked at residential schools were evil people. It was an evil system, but not everybody that worked there was evil. There was people that tried to protect those children, people that lost their jobs for protecting those children, people that went to incredible lengths to protect children. And I think that's important and that's significant. And we need to find ways of honoring some of those people that made those tremendous sacrifices to try to protect children, and not to paint everybody with the same brush. In 2008, the Prime Minister of Canada, in fulfillment of a promise that was made by former Prime Minister Paul Martin to National Chief Fontaine, offered an apology in the Parliament of Canada. I won't tell the story about getting to the apology because we don't have time to do that. But suffice it to say that it was a struggle to have survivors and the national Indigenous leaders in the House of Commons, on the floor of the House of Commons, to receive the apology. And the Prime Minister talked about the fact that residential schools went on for over a century. 150,000 Aboriginal children were taken from their families. The objective of residential schools was to systematically remove children and isolate children from the influence of their homes, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. He talked about one of the objectives was indeed to kill the Indian in the child. One of the things he talked about was the number of children that died. He didn't say the number, but tragically many children died at residential schools. He talked about how wrong it was. But he said the burden of this experience has been on your shoulders for far too long. The burden is properly ours as a country and as a government. There is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again. And I don't know, as a government and as a country, whether we've lifted the burden off the shoulders of residential school survivors and their families. It seems to me that in many ways we've added to the burden in terms of the lack of policy, the lack of funding for things that would be really important to survivors, like seeing their kids or their grandchildren or their great-grandchildren receive proper educations, to see them have clean drinking water, to see things like the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women dealt with in a fair way. My friend Guy up here and I went over to Carleton University this afternoon to see the, I don't even know, it's an exhibit, but it seems almost profane to call it Walking with Their Sisters.
Called the commemoration.
Thank you. Commemoration. And I'd encourage everyone here, if you haven't done so, to go over to Carleton and walk with those sisters. It's an incredibly profound experience. It's something that every person in the country should experience, because it talks, on the one hand, about this incredible tragedy and sorrow, much like residential schools, but it also talks about the spirit of hope and the spirit of kinship and the offer of moving forward together. And I think that's one of the things that we've seen from the Indigenous people of this country, is the hope that we'll find within ourselves as a country the reasons for moving ahead and for finding a different way of looking at each other. I know from my time in Ottawa, I meet with parliamentarians all the time, and they would say one of several things, but one thing they would always say to me is, Bob, if there was just one thing that we could do to make things better, what would that be? And I said, the one thing you could do is deal with a whole bunch of issues all at the same time and move them forward. And then they say, you know, well, we really can't, you know, Aboriginal issues just aren't really a priority for our constituency. And I represent my constituents. So if my constituents don't really care about your issues, it's hard for me to represent them, because I wouldn't be representing what they care about. Which to me says two things. One, we have representatives of the Crown not understanding the fundamental concept of honor of the Crown, which the Supreme Court has directed the Crown to do, to act in an honorable way in terms of the treatment of Indigenous people. And two, we really do need to educate Canadians about their own history, starting with residential schools and other issues, and doing it in such a way that offers promise. If there's you know, one thing that when we're setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that I think then Minister of Indian Affairs Chuck Straw was right about, he said, we can't get stuck in the past. We have to be able to understand the past, but we have to present something to Canada in terms of a future, in terms of some hope. And I think in many ways we've done this. We've had many NGOs talk about the importance of investment in Aboriginal people. We've been told by the Canadian Centre for the Study of Living Standards that if we could just close the gap in the Human Development Index, it would lead to a cumulative benefit of over $400 billion in 2006 dollars over the next 40 years. So this isn't money that's being thrown away. I think that's oftentimes perception when we talk about Indigenous issues, that it's throwing good money after bad. But it's not. It's an investment. People have done the work. But it seems to me that there may be, I don't know, some secret cabal or something within the Government of Canada, maybe within Privy Council Office and Treasury Board and Finance and the Department of Justice all together, that actually believe that when Duncan Campbell Scott said that he's going to put an end to the Indian question, and in a short time there will no longer be an Indian question in Canada, that it's going to happen. Like maybe this weekend something's going to happen, and there will no longer be an Indian question. So what's the sense of investing in Indigenous people if there's not going to be an Indian question? But otherwise, it's hard to understand why folks wouldn't make that bet. That to close the gap in the Human Development Index between Aboriginal people and the rest of Canada, that there's going to be incredible benefit for all of us as a country, why wouldn't they make that bet? But they won't. We've, what time is it? That clock working? Okay, so I'm supposed to wrap up 5 minutes ago. But Albert took some of my time, which is okay because he's an elder. But so I'll try to close up here. There's an important book that I recommend to folks, written by a good friend of ours. Her name is Paulette Regan. The book's called Unsettling the Settler Within. And Taegi Alford wrote the foreword to her book. And he said, unsettling the settler within means that non-natives must struggle to confront their own colonial mentality, moral indifference, and historical ignorance as part of a massive truth-telling about Canada's past and present relationship with the original inhabitants of this land. So we need this massive education program so that we have a joint understanding of our mutual history, so that we can see each other in a different way. A good friend of mine, Andy, he was up in the Nunavut Territory not that long ago, and he went out caribou hunting with an Inuit elder. And they got up to this high point of land, and the elder said, this is going to be a really good place to find caribou. They always come by right down there. And Andy said, okay. And the elder, he gets his binocular out, but he only got one eye that works in the binocular. And he's looking down there. He says, oh yeah, there's caribou down there now. And he hands the binoculars to Andy. And Andy looks down there and he says, I don't see any caribou. He says, no, they're down there. And he says, all I can see is a bunch of rocks down there. And he said, wait a minute. Those rocks are starting to move. And the other said, yeah, that's caribou. And that's kind of the way I think we are as a country. We have a hard time sort of seeing each other because of misconceptions, because of stereotypes, because of blindness from historical misperceptions. Mikhail Jean told us, when the present does not recognize the wrongs of the past, the future takes its revenge. For that reason, we must never turn away from the opportunity of confronting history together, the opportunity to right a historical wrong. This has to happen in our history. We need to come together to confront this history together. Mikhail Jean said some really strong words. Now we've heard from the TRC. We know that both the TRC, former Supreme Court Justice Beverly McLaughlin, former Prime Minister Paul Martin have all talked about the residential school experience as cultural genocide. And when I first heard that, I kind of wondered, why do we need an adjective? Isn't it just genocide? But the TRC explained that. They talked about the difference between physical genocide, biological genocide, and cultural genocide. They said cultural genocide is the destruction of those structures and practices that allow the group to continue as a group. States that engage in cultural genocide set out to destroy the political and social institutions of the targeted group. Land is seized, populations are forcibly transferred, and their movement is restricted. Languages are banned, spiritual leaders are persecuted, spiritual practices are forbidden, the objects of spiritual value are confiscated and destroyed, and most significantly to the issue at hand, families are disrupted to prevent the transmission of cultural values and identity from one generation to the next. In dealing with the Aboriginal people of Canada did all of these things. But they've also helped us think about a path forward. In every facet of Canadian existence that we can think of, from sports to culture to education to lawmaking to governance to churches to NGOs to environment, like everything you can think of, that there's an opportunity to express reconciliation in every facet of our life as a country. We need the will to be able to do that. I know there's a lot of people out there that have a hard time with reconciliation. They get caught up in fancy words saying if there's no conciliation in the first place, then how can you have reconciliation? Like, I think that's just not a really good starting point. Or people that don't believe that the government of Canada has it in them to be a leader in terms of reconciliation. I don't think that's true, because I think the government of Canada can be a mirror of the people of Canada, and I think the people of Canada are essentially good. My friend, I was at a conference at the University of Western Ontario a couple of years ago, and one of the professors took me on about reconciliation and called me naive for believing in reconciliation. So I told him about my friend Ken, who's a third-generation residential school survivor. And I remember him coming into my office one day, and he said, Bob, he said, most amazing thing happened on the weekend. Ken was about 60 at the time. I said, what happened, Ken? He said, I told my daughter I loved her for the first time. He said, no one ever told me that they loved me when I was a kid. I didn't know that was part of the bargain between parent and child. And I think about that, and I think about all the Kens in the world, in this country, and all the daughters who are like Ken's daughter, and all those little wee tiny reconciliations that are happening all over the country. And I even think about this meeting tonight and the power of thought, and even just if one person thinks a little bit differently, that thoughts are power, and they're powerful, and power can change this country. And there will be like a whole thousands and millions of little snowflakes, but they'll gather together, and we'll recognize these snowballs or snowmen or snowwomen or something, but it's going to be all these little wee tiny reconciliations. I don't think it's going to be a national hug on Parliament Hill between the national chief and the Inuit leader and the Métis leader and the Prime Minister, and there'll be trickle-down reconciliation. That's not going to happen. It's going to take a whole bunch of all of us, like Ken, finding ways of reconciling with each other. So there's a path for each and every one of us. There's a job for each and every one of us in terms of reconciliation. When we were setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we had this wonderful meeting out in Calgary. And the wonderful statesman and Métis leader, Paul Chartrand, he addressed the conference. And he talked about the difficulty of setting up Truth and Reconciliations Commissions and the support that they need. And he said TRCs are like spring ice, or maybe like fall ice, and we're going to experience some of that really soon. You go out in the morning and maybe on your pond or in the ditch or in a puddle, there's that really thin ice. And he said if you're not careful with it, it's so fragile, it'll crumble in your hand. But if you get a bunch of hands together and you work together and you lift up that ice and you hold it up to the light, it becomes this prism. And all these beautiful colors, all this splendor is revealed to all of us. And he says that's the challenge of the TRCs. He said it's going to take all of us putting our hands together to hold up that TRC report and the work of the TRC and hold it up so it's like a prism. And it shines that light and that splendor on each and every one of us. And that light gives us that hope that we can reconcile, that we can make a better future for each and every one of our children and our grandchildren. If there's one thing in this country that I think binds all of us together, is that we want something better for our kids and our grandkids and what we inherited. And if there's nothing else that should drive us towards reconciliation, it should be the hope for our kids and our grandkids. Thank you very much. Miigwech.